Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session to discuss Detroit, a case study in changing a city's fortune. My name's Gillian Ted. I'm the US Managing Editor of the Financial Times. And I have to confess that I've been looking forward to this session all week because I think it's going to be terrific. Detroit is an amazing story. Not just amazing for anyone who lives in Detroit, but I think for the wider American situation, if not the wider world. Because one thing I've learned in my time as a reporter is that if you want to feel really depressed, you should go to Washington. Because these days, anything to do with the federal government is pretty darn depressing. But one of the great distinctive features about America is the federal system and the fact that the Founding Fathers gave so much freedom to different areas of the country to experiment. And all over America today, you have these incredible laboratory test tube cases of people trying to see what works and what doesn't work at the local level in terms of trying to fix problems, move business ahead, show real leadership, and leadership is a key issue we're going to be discussing, and essentially push America forward. And Detroit has many lessons, not just for other parts of America, not just for the federal system, but for many other parts of the Western world that are saddled with a lot of debt. So we have a terrific panel of people to talk about this this afternoon. On my left, your far right, is Governor Snyder, I think a man known to many of you. On my immediate left, your right, is Kevyn Orr, former emergency manager of Detroit. Next to me, on my right, to your left, is Dan Gilbert, the founder and chairman of Quicken Loans and Rock Ventures, and somebody who's poured his heart, soul, and money into Detroit born. And then at the end is Ken Buckfire, who's president and co-founder of Miller Buckfire, who was at the heart of the efforts to restructure Detroit's problem loans. But before we start, I want to do a quick question to you in the audience. In fact, 2 or 3 quick questions, just to check you're awake and engaged, but also to give the panelists a sense of who we're actually talking to. Who in the audience was actually born in Detroit or near Detroit?
Huh? Oh.
Wow.
All right.
Hey.
All right.
Okay. Okay, home team advantage.
Wow.
Who in the audience has been to Detroit?
Wow.
Great, okay.
Yeah.
Who in the audience has invested in Detroit debt at some point?
You can admit it, it's okay.
Interesting. Okay, and just lastly, who in the audience is investing in troubled sovereign debts or risky sovereign debts of any sort, or public sector debts, be that Puerto Rico, Greece, or anything else? Because I think that may be relevant. Okay. Interesting, right. Well, you're talking to your home crowd, Governor Snyder. You may be preaching to the converted. But let's start with you. I'd like to know, your story of your entry into politics is extraordinary. You didn't decide to run for governorship until 2009. You didn't get elected until 2010. But you came in very much with a mission to try and fix Detroit, a place that many people thought was completely unfixable. What made you decide to risk your political career?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Jillian. To put it in a simple sense, it was to do the right thing. That's why I wanted the job, because it hadn't gotten done. And if you step back and look at the quick story it was in early 2009, I went out to dinner with my wife. And it wasn't just Detroit. Michigan was a broken state. Many of you know that. We were 50 out of 50 in so many different things. We're the only state that had lost population in the last census. So many people that were running were talking about fixing Michigan. And my view was fixing Michigan was simply not good enough. It was time to reinvent our state, to bring a whole new attitude and approach, have leadership and results to our citizens. So I ran, and the commitment I made to our citizens, but also I started by making a commitment to my wife, because she sort of called me out and said, well, if you believe this way, we should talk about you running for governor. And that's what really started it. But the commitment I made is to say, I'm going to clean this up. I'm going to give everything I can to take on the problems that had been in our state for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Because I want to hopefully be part of solutions to solve those problems, so whoever follows me will not have to deal with them again. And so in large part, Detroit's an awesome illustration of that. in the negative. It was something that had been building up for 50 years. And people have to put in context. The question I always got about the bankruptcy is you've got this huge new problem, you have this bankruptcy, and the answer is no. The bankruptcy is a tool to bring a solution to a problem that most people didn't think was solvable. To put it in context, everyone was very familiar to talk about the debt reduction in Detroit with the bankruptcy. Obviously, we had huge issues with retirees, and I appreciate the sacrifice they made. We had the issue with the Detroit Institute of Art. But two things people don't stop and think about enough. One is the citizens of Detroit, the people I work for all the citizens of Michigan, simply were not getting the services they deserve. They were not getting police protection, fire protection, the lights weren't on, the trash wasn't being picked up. They deserved better, and it needed to happen. And even more heartbreaking in many ways is a lot of people had given up hope. They'd given up hope that Detroit could be turned around. Not everyone, and that's where I need to thank Dan. Dan was one of the people from the private sector that stood up, that believed in Detroit, and some other fine people in the private sector. But the public sector was not doing their part. And it was time for the public sector to stand up and to do our job, and to do our job well. And that's where it started, this whole process, and it started the day I took office. It didn't end. The bankruptcy was kind of accumulation of several years of going through talking about solutions, doing a consent agreement, doing reviews, and ultimately bringing in Kevyn, who in turn recommended the bankruptcy.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask Kevyn in a minute to talk through the details of what actually happened. But before I do that, I mean, you did not have a career in politics, did you? In fact, I think you were telling me earlier in the green room that when you first started running, you were known as Mr. Margin Error because
my early supporters, I call them the Margin of Error Club because I was so low on the polls, people used to come up and tell me, if you take the margin of error, did you know you could be a negative number? And I always thanked them for that kind remark and just rolled up my sleeves and went to work.
Which is, an astonishing story. But I mean, when you decided to go from a career in business, suddenly jump into Michigan as governor, run for governor, faced with this litany of problems, did you have a vision or a model for what you were doing? Because frankly, it seems like if you decided to do that over dinner with your wife one day, that was a pretty expensive, pretty risky dinner.
It wasn't, though, in the sense that I love our state and love our people. In terms of looking at it, though, yeah, I clearly had a vision. It was about reinventing our state. And I always told people the greatest challenge is not changing a law or regulation, but changing a culture. To understand that the future of our state depended on us to stop fighting and blaming one another and get together and solve a problem. And ultimately, that's the biggest lesson that came out of the Detroit bankruptcy to me, is it showed the best of Michigan. It showed people from every corner, every way, every corner of our geography, both political parties, everyone putting that aside to say we could do the grand bargain, which was the linchpin to get this done. That was a moment to say I could see our culture actually changing. We have a lot more work to do, but it was a recognition that if you want leadership in the public sector, you don't do it by blaming and fighting people. I actually call it relentless positive action. No blame, no fighting, just go solve the problem. And it works.
Washington, are you listening? It is an astonishing story, and I say there are a lot of wide lessons there. But I'd like to turn to Kevyn now, because you were very much the person who was, if you like, the CEO of change in Detroit. You were actually in charge of trying to drag Detroit back and get it, if not back on its feet, then back with some kind of fighting chance. Can you tell us a bit about how you actually did that?
Well, as the governor mentioned, and I think there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to this, the amount of spade work that had gone into this effort before I got there in March 2013 was tremendous. The governor and his team actually began this in 2010. In 2011, they designed a Detroit review team. Throughout 2012, there was a March Detroit review team. There was a memorandum of understanding in April 2012. There was another memorandum of Detroit reform in November 2012. There was another Detroit review team in December 2012. There was a Detroit review team report in February 2013. And there was the governor's findings of fact in March 1st, 2013. And there was me. The beauty about my appointment was I was appointed the week after the two past prior mayor had been sentenced to 28 years in Club Fed. So there wasn't exactly a lot of enthusiasm for my appointment when I came, but having looked at the
I think
art,
after that, there's only one way up.
having looked at the art of the amount of work that had gone in, we decided, look, the business case for reform is so apparent that we need to do this. So let's explain that we divide this process into really three stages, right? The entry and assessment stage, by which we reported out the June 14th report, proposal for creditors. Then the plan design and implementation stage, either out of bankruptcy or in bankruptcy was an option. And then finally, the implementation, bench testing, and exit strategy. How do we get out? Bankruptcy is a slip and fall practice. You slip and fall into it, but it's sort of hard to get out of it. And once we did that sort of analysis, we set about the business of trying to provide a real unvarnished report of the current state of affairs of the city so that no one would sort of argue about or waste time debating the business case for what needed to be done. And to this day, the June 14th proposal for creditors, which Ken was involved in, no one's disputed it. 58-minute response times for a police force. Our police officers were on 12-hour shifts. The number one thing they asked for when I came into the city wasn't a restoration of their pay cut in 2010, it was for court time. They wanted to be on 8-hour shifts so they could go and testify against the people that they had arrested the day before. 40% of our lights were out, 20% of our housing stock was down. If you had a heart attack in the city, the ambulance wouldn't get there within 45 minutes, the critical first 45, we had an 80% mortality rate for cardiac arrest in the city. I mean, these statistics were astounding for a major American city. So as the governor just said, our main focus was to start in reporting out the state of the city, but also start working on services, making sure that the citizens could start see an improvement in their daily lives, because at core, a municipality should do 5 things really well. Public works, public safety, public health, finance tax administration, planning and zoning, and then parks and recreation. There are other enterprise things, schools, buses, parking, water department, enterprise functions, but those 5 functions are the core of the business that we need to put out to our customers, and we weren't doing that very well. So we really started dividing those 3 areas and then focusing on how we could push out those services so there'd be a change.
Right. I mean, the scale of the challenges you faced were extraordinary. I mean, I think we have some slides set up to give an idea of the picture of Detroit. I mean, I think probably the first 2 rows in the audience don't actually need it, but for those of us who weren't actually born in Detroit, can we call up the slides, please?
Slide 1.
Slide 1, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just go through these very quickly, and they're available, they're on the website. This slide, it just shows the population range of the city from 1900 to 2010, and you look at it peaking at roughly 1.9, 1.85 in 1950 to a decline. You see from 2000 to 2010, a city of roughly 1.1 million lost 250,000 people, 25,000 people a year. A city the size of Taylor was exiting the city. If we could go to slide 2.
I think that's the biggest, fastest decline of any American city, isn't it?
It was
fastest shrinkage.
Per capita, yes, it was
Yeah.
pretty significant. And the key thing about that, those of you who are from Detroit know this is one of the constants. The key thing about that wasn't just the white flight of the 60s and 70s, that was the black middle class. And if you're in a business case, your customer base is voting with their feet. Your market share is declining because people don't want to be there. This is just a representation of the median home value decline, which you see is quite precipitous, even more precipitous than it was around the rest of the nation. So you saw significant reduction in the net worth of the citizens that stayed in the city. If we can go to slide 3, the next slide, please. And this just shows you our manufacturing share. Of course, 2009 was the auto crisis, but actually, if you look at this, it's showing an uptick. That's the good news. Things are coming back. So when you start focusing on some reform, start looking at it, can turn quite quickly. If we could go to the next slide, please.
And then we might go to...
This is just an analysis of the reduction in the city's total liabilities of roughly $18 billion in debt. The majority of that reduction came out of unsecured credit liabilities. The group on the left, the 2 bars on the left, show total debt and the reduction in total debt after the restructuring. The right bars show the unsecured liabilities and the total debt. The single largest focus, there was a lot of focus on unsecured credit, which was of the $18 billion, it was $2 billion of debt. But the real issue for the city was OPEB, other employee benefits for retirees. That was $5.7 billion. By the year 2023, 73% or $730 million over $1 billion in the general fund would have been going to pay legacy costs, debt service, and OPEB. The city would have not been operational.
Right. So just to stop jumping there for a moment. So you This one shows the scale of the debt challenge when you came in.
Right.
Do you have a way of expressing that as a percentage of GDP or what it was as per capita or anything like that? Because I'm curious, if you look at Detroit's debt burden, which was staggering, and the level of urban decline, I'm just curious as to how it would rank compared to, say, other highly indebted cities or areas.
It was unprecedented.
Was it worse than Greece? Well, okay.
Well,
it was unprecedented in America.
Unprecedented domesticated. I won't speak to Greece, but the real thing wasn't just the debt. The real thing was, and this is net of deferrals. I mean, we were also deferring obligations we had to pension funds. We were not running our city in an appropriate, orthodox manner. Worse than that, it was driving the failure to deliver services to the residents, to the business community, as you would want them in a city, and our infrastructure was crumbling. So the debt was crushing on a number of levels, but at core, it was expressing itself in terms of a decline and decay in the city's quality of life.
Right, so it wasn't just the numbers, it was actually the human cost, yes.
Very real.
Ken, though, you make your living off looking at the numbers. How did you work with Kevyn and the governor to actually tackle this? Briefly, because we don't have a lot of time for details, but I mean, give us a brief sense.
Without getting into too much detail, what Detroit represents is an application of what I would call Chapter 11 thinking to what had been in the past a Chapter 9 situation. Other Chapter 9s, Stockton, Vallejo, Jefferson County, have all been about allocating the pie between the bondholders and the pension plans. In Detroit, for the first time, because restoration of services was the key, we put the citizens of Detroit first. We put them at the table where they had not been anywhere else. Once we calculated, which took months, what we had to reinvest in the city to restore adequate services. This is not a gold-plated city by any means, but it'll be adequate, I think.
Right.
It turned out we needed $1.5 billion of investment over 10 years to restore adequate services. That money is all coming out of Detroit's existing revenue base, which means it's not available for the creditors. And that was the biggest challenge we had, was designing a plan that once we identified that was the budget requirement, how do we invest that properly, which is what Kevyn spent a lot of time wrestling with the city about. And then how do we convince the creditors and the pension funds that they're not going to run the city on the rocks, so the entire debt burden is basically on the one person left who hasn't moved out of the city. And if you ask yourself the question, how do the creditors view it, their answer would be, well, the revenue's there, we want it, we don't care about the city, but that means you have no long-term viability. And that was the biggest single battle we had in this case, was convincing, frankly, the court that, in fact, the needs of the city had to come first, and then whatever was left over, we would give to the creditors.
Now, that did not make you popular amongst much of the investment community, did it?
Well, I was fair. No.
I mean, I had people coming up to me and saying that what was going on in Detroit was essentially attacking the very heart of capitalism. You were turning the normal waterfall structure upside down. This would essentially undermine the capital markets, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I mean, you guys were not popular with many of the people at this conference.
Well,
anyone like to?
Still aren't.
well, I hope that's not true.
They did know they were investing in Detroit when they bought the bonds, right?
Right.
I mean, that's right. I mean, so
No,
Yes.
it's a very good question. I think Kevyn has an answer for it, because when we were in the back rooms negotiating with creditors, Kevyn was out in front every single day dealing with the police, the fire, local community, all of whom wanted to kill him.
Right.
All right, because nothing that he was doing was popular. But the creditors weren't happy with us either, because in the end of the day, they just wanted their money back, which is completely justifiable. The problem was that once you analyzed what the city needed to become a place people would want to live in, there simply wasn't enough money. And the challenge we had was to convince everyone that we were really giving them all we could give, including the money from the art bargain. And that's all there was, and they would have to suffer losses, which, and this is the other point I think people should notice, the big dispute in Detroit was between the pension fund creditors and the general obligation bondholders and the secured creditors. Because what did we do in Detroit that was new and unique? I was at a panel this morning with someone who argued that in Detroit, the GO bondholders got off better than he thought. Well, the GO bonds, because in bond market convention, are out of the senior to revenue bonds. That's only a convention, it's not the law. And what we showed in Detroit was that secured bonds are secured. Every secured bondholder in Detroit got 100% recovery.
It's on the dollar.
Every penny, but they didn't get any more than that. And the GO bondholders were unsecured, just like the pension claims. But that, by the way, was another battle we had to fight. Detroit represents the first time that a federal court ruled that pension claim liabilities are not constitutionally protected. They're unsecured claims. That did not make anybody popular, but that's the law.
Well, that clearly has big implications going forward. I mean, just to remind the audience, so the secured creditors got 100 cents on the dollar. What did the unsecured creditors get, and what cents on the dollar did the pensioners get?
we have a slide on
that's,
that.
yeah, we do
There's-
have a slide if you go down. This is the percentage recovery for each class, and you see the secured got 100 cents. The last one, the 36th District Court, is a little bit distorted because their claims were generally less than $4 million. But if you look at some of the others, each of them had different arguments. For instance, the limited tax general obligation bondholders had arguments regarding first dollar priority. The UTGO bondholders had an argument that they had a dedicated millage revenue stream that we couldn't collect unless we were paying the millage. So they all had legal arguments. The pension funds, which you see the highest rate of recovery for a range, you have to remember they actually had assets in the pension funds. Some of them included a defunct corporate jet and a very bad amusement park and other things, some folly like that. And 4 of their trustees were doing a bid at Club Fed for some of their behavior, but they actually had assets, so their percentage recovery is going to be different. The average recovery, though, for the general unsecured was 10 to 13%. And that is consistent in other bankruptcies. So when Ken says you're bringing Chapter 11 principles to a Chapter 9 case, we're dealing with the 17 classes that we had based upon their own specifically tranche, level, and legal arguments, all of which we're trying to avoid for their benefit, they're trying to avoid for ours, but also recognizing that we cannot pay everybody 75 cents on the dollar. Doesn't matter, we don't have it, we can't pay you, so we have to adjust it accordingly.
Right.
That's all we tried to
And I think it's also worth pointing out on this page, for those of you who are interested in the numbers, some of the, you might say that the pension funds claims got treated better. Well, actually they didn't for the reason Kevin just mentioned, but you should also appreciate that of the $7 billion of unsecured claims that he had, leaving aside the $2 billion that was unsecured GO bonds and COPS, the rest were pension fund claims and healthcare claims. What we negotiated with the unions was a grand bargain of sorts where we canceled healthcare, which was beyond gold-plated, and all the employees went to Obamacare, which resulted in a massive savings to the city of an unfunded liability. And that value that we found was actually, we moved into the pension funds. So on an average basis, the pension funds did not do much better than the bondholders did when you take into account their claims were not only the pension funds, but also the healthcare liabilities.
Right, without getting too far in the weeds, one thing you need to understand is, unlike some other municipalities that paid a lump sum at the end to get out of their healthcare obligations, because here, just understanding the stack of debt, $5.7 billion for healthcare OPEB, $3.5 billion unfunded pension obligations, unfunded actuarial liability, $2 billion general unsecured debt. The single smallest portion of unsecured debt was the GO bonds, the ones that the bond buyer and everybody was castigating us for destroying capitalism as we know it today, which we did not do. But the largest were OPEB, and the second largest was the pension unfunding. We created a VIVA system whereby the city will pay in for the next 20 years $30 million to help fund the VIVA, run by trustee boards for both the general service pension and the police and fire pension, to provide health care to these retirees, many of whom are elderly. Our general service average pension is $19,400. Is there anybody in this room that could live on $19,400 a year? Anyone? No. So modest pensions, trying to provide our retirees for health care for which there was not one dime set aside, and they control their ability to do that, so there's a sense of efficacy. On the pension side, we also establish a pension funding mechanism that walls them off for 9 years. If they manage their affairs and get their pensions topped up to a certain level, they have the ability to restore the pension funding.
Right.
So it was really
There's
trying to be
clearly-
fair.
Clearly a lot of lessons here
Right.
for the wider, well, not so much the federal system, but for other governments and how to deal with this. Before we talk a bit more about the numbers, though, I'd like to bring in Dan. You were born in Detroit, is that right?
Yes.
And you've built your businesses around near Detroit, and yet you decided to move back into Detroit.
Yeah.
Can I first start by asking you, in the middle of all these troubles, did it ever occur to you to do what half the city did and just leave?
Well, yeah, it definitely occurred to us, many times. Before I forget, though, I just have to tell you, these guys here, they're understating sort of what they've done, especially Kevin here. Being from Detroit, born, raised, having my life there and our businesses and everybody I know basically there, you cannot underestimate what these guys and Kevin, most people wouldn't even have dared, speaking of going to Detroit, wouldn't even have dared to accept the position. I'm not sure there's another person on the planet that could have gotten done what you got done, what everybody got done. And it was just a little over a year. Everyone was predicting this thing was going to be tied up till forever, right? 3-4 years. And we can talk a lot about that, but I just want to make sure I said that, got my
Thank
points in and everything else. Okay.
Yeah.
What was your question?
Why didn't you
The
leave Detroit?
question was, did you ever think back in 2008, 9 of just bailing, just getting out of Detroit?
That's always easier said than done. When you have a business that's got several thousand people working in it and everybody has their life there and their families there, it's really not, people talk those kinds of things and you always hear, hey, Detroit should go out, or if you're in a big city, you should go recruit businesses from other cities. I mean, what kind of city, big urban core anyway, has ever been built because they've gone and recruited other businesses from anywhere? It's really never happened. And once in a while, you get a big company that moves. So, I think because it's hard to do, it's hard to move big businesses. But for us, it was really twofold. A lot of people have a misunderstanding of what we've done and what we're doing in Detroit. They think that because myself and many of us are born and raised in the city and from the area and it's generational, that we're doing all this all because it's a feel-good thing. Yes, it is a feel-good thing, but it's an investment thing, and it's also an attraction talent thing. I mean, we've got close to 13,000 people now working downtown, and we only moved our first people there in August of 2010, and we felt we had to move from a suburban location into the urban core because there was this macro trend that continues to happen, that the talented, best graduates and people, entrepreneurs, as well as technology people and marketing and others, engineers, that they want to be in urban cores this generation. And we felt, in a suburban location, it's not going to happen for us. We, for the first time in our evolution as a business, we started losing people, not losing, but not getting people who automatically would have come. Oh, yeah, and of course we'll come to your business. And we started getting kind of concerned about it in the few years before we moved. And so the biggest urban core that was around was downtown Detroit. Obviously the cost of things there were much lower. And so it's worked both ways. We would never be the company or companies that we are today, spread out among a bunch of suburban buildings that we are in a campus-like setting in a downtown core.
So now we've had the restructuring. You've worked yourself out of a job in some ways.
Got fired.
You got fired. I think plenty more people will hire you. But you've basically had the restructuring. You've come out of the worst of it, as it were. Still a lot of challenges ahead. What do you think, as someone who's trying to invest in Detroit's future now, are the critical challenges? And are you confident that the regeneration will now happen?
Well, for those who haven't been to Detroit recently, and I'll state this sort of for the record, downtown Detroit is booming.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just doing okay, it's doing the best that anybody remembers really that's alive today. I mean, it might be, again, you go back to maybe mid to early 60s and earlier, I'm sure there was great economic activity as a center, but you can't find office space for a significant user in downtown Detroit today. The big buildings are 100% occupied. There's no residential units available right now. The prices are going up. There's all kinds of development coming online, both along the river and in downtown and in Midtown. And so, you got people coming from all over the country and world investing into the real estate and businesses and retail now that is happening. The big concern to Detroit, of course, is the rest of the city, which is the neighborhoods. And there's a lot of people with things that are happening there. There's a blight book that Kevyn just grabbed that we put out about removing the blight.
I'll be selling these in back.
Yep.
When we're done.
$9.99 plus
It's called
tax, shipping and handling.
Detroit blight removal. Every neighborhood has a future, and it doesn't include blight. So, yes.
If I could just interject just for a minute, Dan. Dan chaired the Blight Commission when our federal government partners came in, and Gene Sperling's here, who was instrumental in starting this for a while when he was over at OMB. When they came in and we started this, 20% of the housing stock, this is just residential, is blighted. There's another percentage that's commercial. This is the first compendium of any municipality. Data Driven Detroit, which was a technology company that came in and basically inventoried every unit in the city to tell you its condition, whether or not it was blighted, whether or not it needed to be repaired, and Dan chaired that effort. Now, the reason I'm just interjecting here is it is so crucial to have this from blight, but from my perspective as the emergency manager, if 60% of our fire trucks are rolling to blighted or abandoned structures and are running down our vehicles and putting our firefighters at risk, that hits on the general fund budget. If 20% of our blighted structures are tractors for criminal behavior because they're out, that hits back on the general fund. If 40% of our lights are out, the city is dark, so that a septuagenarian comes home at night, as she told me, her front door is open, she can see the robbers inside of her house. and she makes a call that's going to be 58 minutes before the police come, that hits her quality of life. So this document, which Dan was instrumental in putting together with other folks and the city's civic community in pulling together, was so instrumental to the rebirth, not just in the 9 square miles that we're talking about downtown, but the other 130 square miles in the city. And I think it's the only document of its kind that's ever been done. So for those of you who are interested, I would commend you because it has so much information, but the structure of it is so critical, it's really unprecedented.
Well, it's a model that certainly many others could follow. I'd love to see if Greece or Puerto Rico did something like that. But I'm going to ask, I'd like to ask Ken just to say briefly, what do you think are the lessons from Detroit for other debt-laden cities, countries, areas at the moment? I mean, we haven't got a lot of time. I'd then like to ask the Governor about some of the lessons for leadership and then open it up to the wider audience, including perhaps we can have some comments from Jean about some of the bigger issues. But briefly, Ken, what are the key lessons?
Well, there are many lessons, but I think I'll start with 2. One is there has to be a political commitment to fix the problem and not kick the can down the road, which has been what many other governments and obviously many companies do, because it's just easier. Fixing it is hard. Secondly, there has to be a very clear focus on what do you want the end state to look like. It can't be just, well, business as usual. If it turns out that the city is losing population, losing tax revenues, you have to ask the question, as you would if it was a company who's losing customers, why? And what do we do to turn that around? What investment do I have to make to fix it? In a country or in a state or in a city, it's the same analysis. That is something that, frankly, governments don't seem to be able to do very well because it does require a focus on what do we have to do today to create a longer-term future that generates growing population and growing tax revenues. That, I think, is something that our political system has a hard time dealing with. And you see that now in a place like Puerto Rico, which is, frankly, doing everything wrong. They're focusing on raising money in the bond market without looking at the fundamental reasons why people are leaving Puerto Rico faster than they left Detroit.
Right. I'd actually quickly ask Dan as well. Dan, for you as a businessman, what do you think are the key lessons from Detroit?
Well, you know, there's many of them. I mean, first of all, you know, a bankruptcy in a city the size of Detroit is so unprecedented. But I'll tell you what was a little bit surprising was, so we started moving people down in August of 2010, and the bankruptcy was in 13, September?
July 18th.
July of 13. So we had been there, you know, a little over 3 years, and there was interest for sure in the city, and momentum was building. But you know, and then when the bankruptcy was filed, so your initial reaction was, oh well, now everybody's going to start running. It was the complete opposite, because I think as people in this room know more than anybody that uncertainty is the enemy of investment, and sort of, you know, what else can go back? You know, we filed bankruptcy. That's sort of it. You know, there's nothing sort of worse than that. I guess there is, but not a lot of things. And so, you know, then the phones were ringing off. Everybody knew that was the end, and knew there was at least a vision and a commitment to get out of it and what would happen on the other side. And so, you know, that's sort of lesson one. When there's an issue, we delayed bankruptcy. The city, I don't know how many years you really think, but at least 10, maybe 15.
13 years before it should have happened.
Yeah,
13
it was
years
insolvent
before.
for
So the city should have gone bankrupt 13 years earlier.
Yeah.
It was bankrupt 13 years
Yeah,
ago.
but
right.
because the bond market kept lending the money, they were able to push it off beyond the point of no return.
So lesson number one is, when you know you're going to go bankrupt, just go bankrupt. Be done with it. And it's the end of it, and then you save yourself time, grief, and effort.
I think I omitted one very important lesson, and I apologize. One of the things that made Detroit successful, remember, we spent 2 years planning this, and once Kevyn came in to be the GMM, it got it done over a year. We had very clear communication with the citizens of Detroit and the entire creditor community about, here are all the problems, here's what we're going to do about it, and here's what it means for you. When Kevyn mentioned before the famous June 14th report that we spent 6 months drafting, which is still available online, it's about 180 pages, we laid everything out in brutal detail about not only the problems, but what it would take to fix it. And everybody knew that we were hiding nothing. We had no hidden agenda at all. I think that laid such an important foundation of what I would call the beginning of trust, because believe me, we were not popular at all. That people started to realize we were actually going to follow the plan we'd said, and we never really changed it. The plan we filed in June of that year is almost exactly the plan we ended up confirming when the city came out of bankruptcy this past fall.
Right. I'd like to ask both Kevyn and the Governor, I mean, what do you think are the key lessons in terms of getting stuff done and in terms of exercising leadership? Because I think many people who hear the story of Detroit will say, well, that is amazing, remarkable. Why on earth is it not being replicated elsewhere?
Well, it's a challenging question, and the reason I say that is because no one should aspire to be in bankruptcy. It's not something you should be trying to do. And in fact, one of the things I would say as a recommendation to many people is don't wait. If you have the kind of problems we're talking about, you have to be proactive. And that was one of the great challenges. And I can tell you from a political point of view, we took a lot of heat about having emergency managers. And as a practical matter, I always made it clear to our citizens, my goal is to never have an emergency manager, or if I do, I want them in and out as quick as I can get, because I want the city to be running their city, or whatever community it may be. But you have to make the right decisions. You have to stand up for the citizens ultimately and say they deserve better services. And you had to recreate an environment where people had stopped that environment of just fighting with one another. In many respects, we had a lot of years where if you went to our state, it was too often Detroit versus Michigan. And the message I tried to send to all our citizens, and it's a message that resonated, that was part of the grand bargain, that was the key to the solution, was it's Detroit, Michigan. And so that's where people stepped up and did extraordinary things. So what I would say is having a confidence that people will do good things. And I know that's sometimes really hard to believe, particularly if you're creditors versus debt holders and you're going through all these negotiations. But fundamentally, you have to have a belief people are good. And so we had the foundation community rally, we had the private sector rally. Everyone rallied together in a way they'd never rallied together before. And that was really the creation of the grand bargain, which roughly brought $800 million or so to the table, and particularly to help the pensioners.
Yep.
In terms of the cuts they would have suffered would have been huge otherwise. And so people stepped up. And then the amazing part of this bankruptcy that I have to give tremendous credit to Kevyn, to Ken, and all the people that worked on this is the secured creditor classes, all those other classes largely settled.
Right.
This was amazing by the end. We just recently had an event about a month ago where we were actually at the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Art, celebrating, and it was all the creditors were with the people from the city actually celebrating the success of the bankruptcy, because many of those creditors now were investors in the city. They were taking real estate, they were taking things that they were now committed to develop as part of the solution.
Can
I'd
I
say
ask
there
the governor just one question?
No, please do, yes.
So
You are a citizen, you can certainly ask the governor
well, yeah,
whatever you like.
I know.
You're paying his taxes.
Yeah, so politicians in general, there seems to be a belief that, they put off the big, hard decisions because the belief is if you make them, you're not going to get reelected, and too many people will, I guess, hate you and not like you because you made decisions. But you knew in your heart the decision needed to be made, and you made it, and you got reelected. You can't believe it, but you did. So is there also a lesson here, both nationally and locally, that the citizens of the country are overall not as maybe, or they're smarter than people give them credit for, and that maybe after a short period of time when big decisions are made, they actually will support you, whether they did initially or not when the decision was made?
No, I appreciate that, Dan. A lot of it comes down to too often people talk about politics. And the bottom line, most of this is common sense. This is just stepping up to say this is the common sense right answer. I mean, again, we just had the discussion how many years ago was Detroit essentially bankrupt? And putting it off, that's a disservice to what I was hired to do. So you just have to have people with the conviction to say, hey, this is common sense, this is the right answer, and stick with it. And you have to stick with it through the point, this is the part, there was a lot of heat, a lot of people were not very happy with my decision making, and actually the day I made the call, one comment I made when I declared the bankruptcy is I said, it's interesting, one of the considerations I had is when they write the history books on Detroit, they'll say this was the lowest day in Detroit's history, in the history of a city that at once was the wealthiest city in the United States. But the answer to that question is if I hadn't made that decision to put Detroit in bankruptcy, the next day would have been the lowest day in the history of the city of Detroit. And the day after would have been even lower. So it's just doing the right thing.
Yeah, Jillian, just briefly, I mean, I think there are 4 components, lessons learned to come out of this. And one, I think, is leadership. I mean, I've spoken to it before, and I'll say it again. First-term governor who's dealing with a problem that's been kicked down the road for 2 generations, 60 years. Every politician, both stripes, Republican, Democrat, didn't matter. Their fundamental goal in dealing with Detroit was to avoid it while they was in office. Not on my watch, meaning I'm not going to do anything on my watch. was the #1 watchword, and so the city declined to an unsustainable level throughout that time. And this governor decided he was going to take it on against the advice, I might add, of a lot of folks, including me. Because when I first met with him, my goal was to go in there and to turn the job down softly, but try to preserve the opportunity for my firm to do the work with whatever poor schmo they found to take the job. Okay, and that's when they ended up calling me. And after meeting with him and realizing his level of commitment to it, I felt comfortable that I'd have the backing of the chief executive to do what needed to be done, and that proved to be true. The next thing is talent. Ken, Dan, others. Dan's the head of the #1 mortgage originator, and he can do other things with his time. Yeah. Okay, Ken is head of Miller Buckfire. He can do other things. They came in, and as Ken said, for almost 2 years prior to the declaration to work on creative solutions outside of the box so we wouldn't get bogged down in other ways. And Dan and his cohort, whether it's Roger Penske or all the others or the foundation community, threw in, so everybody was pulling together. Then it's transparency. We on that June 14th report, here it is, raw and unvarnished. We're not holding anything back. We're not gonna hide anything. It's just the truth, the way the current state of affairs. Now, what do you want to do about it? So you have leadership, talents, transparency, and an unprecedented level of cooperation. The judges, the mediators, the legislators of the state, many of whom, when we came in March 2014, would point their finger in my face and said, you know, I'm an outstate legislator. Those of you from Detroit know I'm Lapeer, Traverse City, Leelanau Peninsula, you know, up here. What about me? What about my community? Detroit made their bed, let them lie in it. Okay, this is a moral hazard of doing this. The vote for the state assistance was 107-5, which if you had said that at the beginning of the year was unprecedented. So if you have those 4 things, you can send people to the moon, okay? You can fix a problem, but it takes a severe level of leadership, cooperation, transparency, and talent.
Yeah, one thing I'd actually like to give a public shout out to the many other people that did this. Judge Rhodes did a tremendous job, the mediation team. Again, we were fortunate. We had the best in those positions because the judge decided this case was going to get pursued.
It's going to get done
quickly. Right. The mediators did incredible work. They came up with the concept of this grand bargain we've talked about. And then the foundation community, both Michigan foundations, many of them, plus national foundations, such as the Ford Foundation, the Knight Foundation, came to the table in a way they have never done in the history of their organizations to solve this problem. And they're to be complimented.
Which is indeed the remarkable part of the story, the level of cooperation on so many different groups, which again begs the question of why could it happen in Detroit? Why is it so hard to implement in so many other parts
honestly,
right now?
Jillian, I think though, a large part of this, and we've said this before, is you have to have strong, committed leadership that wants the process to happen, and you have to have a plan that everybody understands and can see why it's logical and rational, because as the governor has indicated, the so-called grand bargain where they raised $800 million to save the DIA, that was only possible when you put it in the context of everything else we were trying to do. For example, one of the reasons the outstate legislators voted in favor of state support for this is because the unions agreed not to sue the state over their pension rights. So once we created this gigantic machine that started going down the tracks to solving the balance sheet and restructuring issues in Detroit, there was so much inertia and momentum built up, people had to jump on to solve their other problems. And we made it possible for them to do that in a way that created much more value than they could have ever generated for themselves before.
If I could just add just one quick thing to that, though, it does, because you guys were mentioning Puerto Rico and some other places that...
Greece.
And Greece, you know, I don't have much knowledge about it except, you know, reading that they have financial challenges, but it starts with one human being and one person. If you don't have the right governor, you know, forget about it. It's over. So, you know, as you talk through all these things and look at it, if it's not happening in Puerto Rico or Greece or where else, it's because one person is not willing to take a stand and do what's right and not care about what's best versus who's right and all that stuff. So, you know, it really comes down to that.
Well, maybe there's a job for Kevyn in Greece. Athens is calling. But I'm conscious we have a lot of people in the room who are interested in the story. Actually, many of you appear to have been born in Detroit or a Michigan area, so I'm sure you have a very deep level of interest. So I'd like to turn to some questions and comments from the audience. We have some microphones, I believe, in the audience. That's great. As ever, it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. Please keep your comments and questions very short because we do have a number of you already waving their hands. And while you're collecting your thoughts, I'd like to just quickly ask whether Gene Sperling, who was with the federal government at the time, wants to just quickly make one or two comments, because The federal government's support on this was, of course, very important, particularly given that Detroit was facing charges of having overturned capitalism. And I'm just curious to know, what your thoughts are, and also whether you think there's anything or any way that what happened in Detroit could ever work in Washington.
Here's coming up.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing we had to do was in some ways one of the hardest things for me, which was as a native of Michigan and a brother who's a kind of a hero in Detroit, and all our love for the city, was the first thing we had to do was tell everybody there wasn't going to be a federal bailout. Because it was very easy politically for us to say we were for it, and it would not have had a chance in hell. It was not going to go through the Republican House, and even if you could have, it would have had to be extremely punitive to prevent the moral hazard. Right. So the first thing you had to do, and we were already talking to Kevyn at this point, and to Kevin's credit, the first time he came in to talk to us, he came in with David Bing.
Yeah.
So there's a human element here too. You had a mayor there who was a hero in Detroit and was stuck in a very bad system, and I think they, never made it personal against him. They tried to bring him in, and so I think the first thing we had to do was say, there is no hope. And it would have been irresponsible for us to give hope that there could be a bailout when there was zero. Couldn't happen. So then for us, what we tried to do then was we figured rightly that a city that was as dysfunctional as Detroit probably had hundreds of millions of dollars stuck in the pipeline. And so the president made me the point person, and our cabinet members rallied. And what we did is we got everyone to look at every place. And remarkably, we found nearly $300 million that had not got out the door. So I think that was, that was just an all-administration effort, cabinet members who cared, OMB was willing to cooperate. Now, there's a lesson in there in one thing. I can't tell you, though, they've described how everybody's helped, but there really is kind of a moment. The bankruptcy happens, and it looks very hopeless. And there's this moment, and Dan was there, in the Roosevelt Room, just right across from the Oval Office, where Dan Gilbert and the heads of the foundations and other people came in, and it was truly one of the most inspiring things in government. They came in and said, we're all in. We love Detroit. We're going to do everything. And to have that kind of, the Dan Gilbert giving people incentives to buy their houses in Detroit, he's all in. At the same time, have the foundation community saying, we're here, we're going to contribute. It just made, it's like, what's a bank run? A bank run's when everybody runs as fast as they can. And here was all these people together saying, we're staying, we're in. And I want to just say one thing technically about the foundation community, and it was Skillman, Knight, Kresge, Ford, they were terrific. But there's very practical ways that might be relevant for people to say. So we'd have a situation where it turns out $25 million hasn't gone out from DHS for firemen and stuff. And that's like heartbreaking. They don't have cars. But, you've got serious people at those places that decided they can't responsibly write that check. Well, a foundation comes in and says, we'll write a check for $500,000 to a McKinsey or somebody to come in and work. That gives the confidence. A few $100,000 help leverage us getting things out the door. What was just really important, though, we then had another amazing day with everybody here, myself, members of the black leadership around the table, 50 people who usually fight. And, that day was an amazing day. And it was headlines everywhere. And that just also reminded me how much we care. The United States government is there. We're going to help. We're all going to work together. Here's Mayor Bing. Here's Kevyn Orr. Here's Snyder. Here's heads of the black churches. They're all around the table. That was kind of a very beautiful moment. And I will say leadership of the governor, what Dan Gilbert has done individually to help the city out is enormous. I will say picking the right emergency manager is everything, though. I mean, because it's not just getting the numbers right. You're doing really painful things. I think the biggest scare for all of us were the pension guys. But I will say the final thing is, Dan said downtown Detroit is great. The great challenge in Detroit is not to allow a sense of two Detroits or a racially divided Detroit where neighborhoods are different. And you had to start with the downtown, and you can see the neighborhoods getting better. You can see some of the home prices going up, but nobody here wants to do any celebration until it's firmly won Detroit.
Good point.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting and also very moving. We have a lot of hands waving, so what I'm going to do is actually take 2 or 3, 4 questions and then try and group it together, or comments. As ever, keep them short and brief, and if you can, identify yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I think local governments around the country are going to experience something similar to this. One question, you didn't really talk about how public employees fared going forward. For example, do they still have pensions, health care? Are they contributing now to health care themselves? What's the status of them?
Okay.
Just
You wanna
briefly.
answer quickly, and then we'll take the next one, yes.
Oh, I'm going to take
Yeah.
that. Okay, briefly. Public employees, we didn't have to do a reduction in force because we managed workload by attrition. We did have a new structure in place where the finance cluster can pilot out performance appraisals so people actually can work to the level of their job. We moved them down from a platinum level of healthcare to a gold level of healthcare and increased their deductibles to the same level at the state level going forward. So actually we tried, and they have a hybrid pension plan. There was a lot of argument about should we be on a DB, defined benefit, and go to a DC. It's a hybrid plan actually, but it walls the city off from a period of time from any exposure. So in all fairness, and they voted for it by 87%, were the pensioners for the plan. So in all fairness to the pensioners were sort of the symbol for the current employees, or how they're going to be treated when they retire. We tried to be compassionate, we tried to be fair, we tried to be open, and it appears that the majority felt that was the right thing to do.
Right.
Yes, my name is John Kingston. I'm the president of the McGraw-Hill Institute. I'm not from Detroit, but I do want to say since I was 11 years old, I'm a rabid Tigers fan. I'm out there several times a year.
Very good.
Good day.
Right.
That
So
makes
seriously, I've been following the city very closely for many years, and 2 questions I had. Number one is, how significant or how important is it for the plan to, I hate to say abandon parts of the city, but to simply sort of shrink the size of it and say there's only a certain footprint where we can do municipal services? The second is sort of a question observation. You know, I look at Mr. Gilbert and all the other individuals that Gene Sperling talked about. I put Mike Illich in that group too. Yeah. I don't know that that's easily replicated in any other city. This does seem like an extraordinary lineup of individuals, and I just don't know that you can pull that off in another distressed area.
So can we clone you, Dan?
Oh, I don't know if my wife or my brother or my assistant would want that to happen. Well, again, I think I might have forgot the question. Do shrink it? You know, you've heard people over the years talk about that. I think it's a noble and it has some rationale as a goal or a vision or a mission. I think it's sort of a fantasy. I mean, you can't go to people in neighborhoods and just say, we're going to buy you out, move, we're going to buy your house. It just, they dig in, they resist. It's years long in court cases. The good news is this, is that when you think about these, some of them former neighborhoods, right? You think about several, in some cases, several thousand lots, maybe even 500 lots, smaller in some cases, 300, 800. And you think about, in the history of Western civilization, have you ever had land where there's streets and sewer and water and electric and cable and phone and everything there with paved streets, platted properties, and the foundation or the land bank is taking this back in, and then you go out to developers and you give them, there's various models. They did things like this similar in parts of New York where you say, what are the 2 biggest things that people object to moving into a new construction home in the city of Detroit? It's very simple, right? There's no schools education. Well, there are schools, but there's no great schools education for them, or very few, and there's a crime issue. Well, if you make it a condition to the developer, we're going to give you this land and utilities, big portion of development. Here's the conditions. Condition 1, I'll be done in 20 seconds, I swear. Condition 1 is you need to build the best charter school, K through 12, that you can with an operator. Number 2 is there's a substation for the Detroit Police DPD, and that gets built first. And there's models like this, and there's a lot of variations of it. There's going to be 2 or 3 of these that come online in Detroit in the next 6 months that begin actual new construction neighborhoods. It's got, I think, wild upside, and maybe all that land does get used, or at least a lot of it, and a few golf courses here or there get added to it too.
Well, there's a lot of people in this audience who probably are interested in investing it, but yes.
I'll be quick. Chris Reynolds from Toyota, proud product, Detroit Public Schools, Cass Tech High School. And because I came out of that system, how can any city's fortunes be revived without a plan to fix the public school system? I hear you say charter, but there are not enough charter schools on the planet. So what's the plan for the public schools?
Yeah, that's Thursday of this week.
They move fast in Detroit.
So I hope that's a timely answer for you. Actually, on Thursday, I'm serious. We had a broad coalition of groups in Detroit come together. They did a good report that talked about education in Detroit. The public schools, we have the Educational Achievement Authority, we have charter schools, a better way to look at education in totality. And they came out with a number of recommendations, and I've now reviewed that. I've spent time talking to them, and later this week, I'm actually going to roll out my recommendations to the state legislature about how we can partner with the city on significant improvement in the educational system, the broad-based system for Detroit. We are seeing improvements in a number of schools, but there's a lot more work to be done. So as we've resolved the city, the public piece of the city in terms of going with an exciting private sector, the next layer is the educational process, and that's going to get resolved.
So I think that's watch this space. I think we have time for one more question. Do we have the microphone?
Yes.
Yes.
Over here.
Yeah.
Johnny Siegel, and I work with retailers and restaurateurs who've looked at Detroit over the years, and I think when you go back 10 years, you can say that it would have been nuts at times for a national restaurateur at times to come downtown. So many of us in my community thought, Dan, you were nuts. And now we look at the investment you've made down there, and it's been quite incredible. So I applaud you for the investment that you made. As you look forward, can you think of one or two things that are the biggest challenges you have as you look forward 5 to 10 years? And if we look backwards 10 years from now, or maybe 20, whatever the number is, what's the definition of success 10 or 20 years from now? What are you going to feel, we did what I wanted done, or all of you, what we wanted done, if we look back and it looks like X?
Are you asking?
Yeah.
Any of you?
I'll say something for 30 seconds, passing on. I think that the biggest challenges in Detroit right now there's still an issue with property taxes and housing. I'm actually going to meet with the governor right after this meeting. We're going to talk about it. We have a plan, but I'm just saying just want to let you know that.
He wants lower
This is not
taxes.
quite the cooperation element, but yes.
Let me tell you what caused the blight in the city of Detroit. You can talk about unemployment, you could talk about crime, you could talk about all this other stuff. The city and the county and the policy on property taxes has caused 97% or more of this disaster of forcing people out of their homes with crazy high taxes, both on the assessed value. The values are assessed 2 or 3, 4, 5 times the actual value, and the millage rate is twice, 3 times what the average maybe should be. And we're forcing, as soon as a home, I'll tell you from the blight report, when somebody leaves a home, when a home becomes unoccupied, there's a 93 to 94% chance from our own data that we did research and good research that the home will become blighted within a very short period of time. So that is the number one. If I answered the other stuff, I'd take up I'll get with you.
Okay, well that's, we don't want to keep you from your meeting, Governor, but.
And I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
To put it in context, I mean, the big issue is we have to grow Detroit. That's the answer. And there's something that's powerful about that, because I think there's a common answer in terms of that's what the mayor, city council believe, that's what I believe that's what all sectors believe, is the future is about growing the city of Detroit. So when you do that look back, the question is, would we be successful in that? Midtown and downtown are doing extremely well, as Dan said. There's great opportunity. It's a great place to invest. We've run out of housing for young people. And we are focused in on the neighborhoods, and that's where this next tier comes into play. That's the issue of schools, property taxes. We're looking at auto insurance rates even. So there's a number of issues there that we're trying to say, how do we get one barrier after another? So what I would say is there's no magic formula for this. This is just good old-fashioned hard work. This is where essentially you say, here's the series of problems, you prioritize what are the biggest problems to the smallest problems, and you just start at the top, knock them off, do one after another, and solve the problem. And that's the spirit that we're doing things in. So the challenge we need to make sure is we continue strong leadership in the city and the state that's working well together.
Right.
That's the biggest message out of this, and we need to make sure people don't fall back to old habits. A cultural change is a very difficult thing to do. We've shown we can all do it, and we've done it for a relatively extended period, but it needs to become ingrained over a longer period of time, and I'm fired up to be part of it.
Right. Well, I must say, as a financial journalist, I've spent 20 years writing about various disasters and challenges and bad news stories. I don't often get to do a good news story. This is still very much a work in progress. It's not yet completed, as you've said, but certainly it's one of the more encouraging stories I've looked at for quite a while. So thank you all very much indeed, and thank you most of all to all of you from Detroit and Michigan who have come along today to try and support and learn and listen. And perhaps we should have a round of applause, not just for the people on the panel right now, but for the wider community in Detroit that have actually made this happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.